In addition to my work, at Brookings, I'm a founder of Policyware, which is an online platform that provides access to essentially short, what we call deep dives taught by experts from the world's top university and think tanks, addressing sort of the most cutting public policy challenges around. So to give you a couple of examples, we've got Paul Schwartz, who's at Berkeley Law School and is the director of their Center for Technology there, teaching a deep dive on developments in global privacy, law and development. We have Sam Sachs from Yale University doing a deep dive on China's digital governance and its global implications. We have someone from University College London, Lauge Paulsen, who does a deep dive on sort of global developments in investment, law and policy. I teach a deep dive on digital trade, and today this will be a bit of a primer for those who might want to get into the topic a little bit more deeply, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of these courses, they're flexibly delivered, so you don't have to take time off from work. It's a mix of pre-recorded lectures and live lectures from the expert, a bit of content released every couple of days. You can watch it at your own pace. It's available to you even if you want to miss it and catch up a bit later. And these public policy courses are really designed for people who are in government or in industry or in civil society who are working in some shape or form on policy or policy-related topics. They want to understand the regulatory environment, maybe to understand political risk and business conditions. They want to understand policy developments because they're in government and they need that as a core part of their job. They may be in civil society organising or advocating around particular policy issues. And this is a way to get access to really the latest thinking, both in terms of the content, but also to understand if you want to be effective driving and changing policies, what do you need to know strategically as an actor in that space? Who really matters? Who are the players? Where, depending on the topic, what are the international organizations or forum where you really need to be engaging? Who are the, where are the alliances that you might want to be building? So we take the participants through essentially these types of questions over the course of the deep dive. So then not only do they walk away with an understanding of really the core substantive issues that they need to be effective, but also a broader sort of 360 strategic view of how does it all fit together? How can I operate in this space to be more effective? So that's what we're doing at Policyware. So we're linked in with your think tank. So there's a link on the ACITI website if anyone's interested to go and learn more, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any further questions.
Sensational. Again, something else we do at ACITI is trying to get government, business, think tanks, and academics together. It sounds like what you're doing at Policyware is bringing all those different aspects together in a way that helps people understand how they all work together so they can contribute to change. It's fantastic. Well done, Josh. Good job. But today's topic, as you say, you've been working a lot on digital trade. Now, I think a lot of people think digital trade is just online shopping, but it's much more than that. So I was hoping if you just give us, like, as I said, a 101 on what digital trade is.
Yeah. So there's no, I guess it's just worth saying there's no globally accepted definition of what is digital trade, but the most commonly used definition is essentially you think about anything that's digitally delivered online. That could be a good, so you could be purchasing it online, it could be delivered to you offline. So it's got elements of being online, but then elements of what looks more like traditional trading goods. Often services are digitally purchased and delivered online. So this is effectively an online education service delivered from the United States to Australia. That would be an element of digital trade. It's also about the movement of data, both as required to enable the digital trade to take place. So you need to be able to be online, you need access to the internet, the information, the payment services. You need the data flow if you're going to be consuming that service as well. And in many respects, like the data is the trade, right? So if you are watching content online, if you are consuming a service, effectively that is a data flow as well. And the final piece I would say that gets brought into this when you particularly start thinking about regulation is the platforms, particularly large platforms, as core enablers of digital trade. So a lot of what we do online is mediated through platforms. So there's the content itself, which is a component of it, but also the platforms which enable that content to be delivered.
So that's so much of that encompasses domestic service providers. And obviously at ACITI, we focus on international trade and investment. So I'm thinking, when you think of digital trade, can you talk a little bit about the international dimension? Is it simply the transfer of those digital services internationally? It's no different to domestic provision of services when we're talking about the international delivery of those services?
Yes. So at one level, the elements of digital trade are reasonably analogous to some of the engagements that we do online domestically, but it also happens to be international. But then the international component adds additional complexity to it. So that's the first part, and I'll get into that shortly. The other part is that increasingly our experience online is through cloud-based services. All our email, the trend, every time we use apps, whether it's an Android or an Apple, it's through app stores that are themselves in the cloud. So it's fair to say that a lot of the way you should think about your experience online is actually mediated through cloud computing today. And cloud computing itself is a very sort of globally distributed service that is also deeply dependent on the ability to move data globally seamlessly. And so a lot of the enabling parts of the stack that allow ultimately consumers and businesses to engage online and globally requires the data flows that the cloud providers rely on to provide that kind of infrastructure in the first place. On the elements that if you sort of bring it down to the e-commerce part, two things worth noting about that. One is that when you look at the value or the importance of, say, digital trade, we naturally want to think about this in terms of our own experience online. You're on Amazon or whatever it may be, and you purchase something from overseas or Etsy or eBay. And that's relevant and that's important. That's part of it, certainly. But the vast majority of the value in digital trade is actually B2B. So the UNCTAD does these reports every couple of years, and they sort of consistently show that it's around 90% of the value of actual sort of e-commerce transactions are actually B2B. It's 10 to 12% are actually sort of the B2C element. So even though obviously that's our personal experience, it's actually the B2B that's very much part of that space. And in the B2B space, but also the B2C space, you need the data flows, as I mentioned, to enable the engagement globally online to take place. But then you get into issues around, the other enabling infrastructure to allow that global transaction to take place. So you need the financial payments mechanisms that work across borders. You need mechanisms that can build trust in the provider and the buyer when these are taking place across borders, and there's sort of digital solutions to that in part, which rely on data flows. You then, when you're delivering a good, as you well know, you then get into more traditional issues around tariffs and customs processes. The thing that's happening in the digital trade space, which has always been exciting, is that it's a big enabler for small businesses in particular. eBay's had a lot of reports out over the years that consistently show that effectively, if you are a small business and you are on eBay, you are almost always exporting. It doesn't matter if you're in Australia or in India or in the US or in South Africa, the data pretty much is similar. And the comparison might be 15 or 20% of sort of your traditional brick and mortar small businesses export, compared to 90, 95%, 100 when you're on eBay. So it's been a big boost for small businesses, but the challenge then becomes that a lot of the movement of goods across borders is not containerized, it's not bulk, it's small packages. So this creates essentially a challenge in the digital trade space for rethinking how you develop efficient customs processes for small parcels. How do you enable returns to take place so that your experience of e-commerce domestically gets to be replicated internationally? How do you have trust when you may not have received the good, but the payment's already been made, and so on and so forth? So these introduced additional regulatory complexities that kind of are part of looking at how do you make digital trade a reality.
It's sort of mind-boggling when you think about traditional international trade, as you mentioned, trade in goods and even services to some extent. it seems so straightforward, yet digital trade seems to be embedded in so many traditional trade routes, whether that's goods or whether that's services. But even more fundamentally, it's so embedded in how we engage commercially, finance, just accessing a whole range of services that we now take very much for granted. So, because the second question I was going to ask you is why is it important, but it seems so bleeding obvious, but at the same time, it's so ingrained, it's a bit hard to see how it's contributing to all these other flows. So can you get into the weeds a little bit? I think you've done it a bit already, but why is digital trade important?
Yeah, no, look, it's a core question, obviously. So, you know, in part, the digital trade element is part of the bigger question about sort of the way economies are going digital. I mean, to your point, the use of digital technologies, cloud-based computing, data analysis, artificial intelligence, is a economy-wide phenomena. And so in many respects, the infusion of data through an economy is, to your point, it's so widespread, it's not necessarily an immediately obvious set of issues because we become used to kind of being surrounded by these developments. But it also underscores, I think, the broad importance of it, because it's not a technology sector specific issue. I think this is sometimes where the debate gets a little sidetracked by a focus on the large technology companies, and they raise specific questions which require policy attention, such as platforms, misinformation, and so forth. But when you think about the kind of broad economic opportunities from the digital space, it's very much an opportunity for the manufacturing sector, for the agriculture sector, for the education, the services sector, for small businesses, as I mentioned. So it's a broad economy-wide opportunity, and it requires both a set of enabling policies at the domestic level, you know, things like access to the internet and broadband and so forth, but as well as the financial payment services. You need the cloud-based infrastructure, you need the skills and the training and so forth. But then there's a huge trade opportunity, right? Because the world's increasingly online. There's over 50% of the world is now online. Certainly the developed world is largely online. So this is a development challenge, and that's a separate set of issues we can get into. But when you think about the opportunity space, it's really one where it's enabling trade to take place in ways that it didn't happen previously. So a couple of ways to think about this. One is that there's a big discussion at the moment about deglobalization, the end of international trade, and people look at, you know, data around trade peaking and so forth. There's a lot of, I think that data is a little overblown to start with, and sort of happens to have coincided with various other points in the global economy, including the GFC and the pandemic, which has probably, I think, overstated the extent that trade has sort of peaked. But the other part of the story is that trade is increasingly digital, and we don't, our statistics agencies really don't know how to capture that effectively, right? We don't have any way of measuring data flows across borders. We have sort of proxies for trying to understand when a service is delivered digitally or otherwise, and so we can kind of get at it in a roundabout way, but it's deeply inaccurate, certainly compared to the way we can measure trade in goods. And so a lot of what's happening globally is not so much deglobalization or a peak in trade, but a transformation of trade from physical goods into digital goods. And so that's a big piece that I think needs to be kind of made clear for policymakers when they think about why is this important. The other element, as I mentioned before, is that it's opening up opportunities for engagement in international trade in ways that was not previously possible. Part of the transformation here is really the digitization of the way businesses add value. So even if you think about the manufacturing sector, what's increasingly obvious is that a lot of the competition across a range of traditional goods, you take automobiles, but you can take Caterpillar heavy moving equipment, you can take Boeing engines. The way that they are kind of adding value is essentially by using data analysis and relying on data flows to do that. So Caterpillar, I use this example in part because obviously we import a lot of that from mines out west, has got a sort of over-the-top digitally driven service called Cat MineStar, where they essentially can control these enormous machines remotely, often from the US. They can, using essentially sensors, they can anticipate through vibrations when parts may be about to fail. They can ship that out from the US to the mines in Australia, so it's there before they actually break down. So a lot of this efficient value-added elements to a traditional good export from the US to Australia is really relying on the ability to move data globally, to analyze it, and to then make business decisions around it. Boeing, which provides, large turbines for aeroplanes, actually now provides this good as a service. So this is the transformation of a good into a service where they use data to analyze the turbine in real time to provide essentially particular they essentially guarantee now hours in the air rather than actually selling you the turbine. And through the collection of data, they can essentially make sure that the servicing and the maintenance is so good and so targeted that they can actually guarantee that they can provide you hours in the air rather than you purchasing the goods. So you're seeing a lot of this data essentially becoming the place where competition happens. I mean, if you are an automobile, if you are in Stuttgart, making German automobiles, your competition is probably coming out of Google rather than, Detroit today, because it's all about autonomous vehicles and so forth. And that's essentially about software and, using very advanced data capturing to allow the car to drive autonomously. So this is all this transformation in terms of where value added is really taking place in just traditional manufacturing sectors. Then you think about supply chains. It was the whole thing was kicked off by the IT revolution and communications and the internet, and now this latest iteration of data is having various impacts along multiple lines. One of them is that you essentially have even deeper insights into essentially the manufacturing space as well as into your customers, and so you have opportunities for even more kind of refined and quicker turnarounds when you think about trying to meet changes in consumer demand. You have forms of additive manufacturing now where you can actually manufacture locally, and so you're transforming what was the trade in that product or good into the trade in the design, into the trade in the data flow, right? So you see a lot of this sort of transformation happening in that space as well. And so this means that if you are in a, particularly if you are in a services orientated sector, where services have, we know that they've been traded for quite a while now, but it's been a small slice of the overall trade world, that's going to grow. And not only is it going to grow, but it's going to create opportunities across developed and developing countries to really be part of these more complex supply chains. And that's the opportunity there as well.
So that's all a bit mind-blowing, actually, because it suggests not only new products, new services, new ways of people dealing with each other, new efficiencies, new factors contributing to productivity, a whole new kind of economy, the way you describe it. At the same time, though, you mentioned that decoupling and the issues that have arisen between the US and China and US friend countries, and how there are concerns. But even before that sort of shift towards decoupling, there have been concerns raised about access to people's personal data, how companies use it and commercialize it, and how it can undermine or create a national security problem. So I think even before, as I said, we got to the decoupling part, there have been concerns raised about digital trade and access to data and data flows. Could you get into that a little bit? And also I should say, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat box or the Q&A box, and we can either address them as we go or we'll have a look at them at the end. Yeah, sorry, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. I think privacy is a great place to start this conversation. I guess let me back into the privacy piece. The way I would describe it is what we've covered so far is we've sort of done a bit of an overview of the opportunities and the transformation that's taking place in terms of trade as a result of data flows. And so there's a big opportunity element happening now. What we're also seeing in parallel is governments looking to regulate in the digital space and to, in effect, restrict data flows, often to achieve other goals, right? Privacy is an absolute important and key one. And in fact, we've done a lot of work looking at the different ways and reasons that governments intervene in the data space and why they restrict data flows and privacy is essentially usually one of the key drivers of that. And so, as you put it, I mean, you've got legitimate government concerns about wanting to ensure that, you know, personal data is protected. And the global internet obviously creates huge challenges, because you can have a great privacy regime in Australia, but the minute you move that data to a third country, you have little insight or ability to have a say over how that data is treated. And consumers, you know, may have no idea where their data is being stored if it ends up in a third country, and so forth. So the natural inclination of regulators is to then restrict or put conditions around when personal data can leave a country. And you know that there are different models for doing that. You've got the European approach under the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which essentially requires adequacy. So they say the third country receiving European personal data needs to have a personal data protection regime which provides essentially equivalent protection as the EU. So effectively, they create a very strong incentive for other countries to follow the GDPR model if they want to get access to European personal data. There's a couple of other mechanisms under GDPR. One's called binding contractual rules, another one's called standard contractual clauses, where essentially when you're contracting out, you essentially put into these arrangements clauses that would bind these other parties receiving European personal data to protect it at the same standards as if it was in Europe. That's one model. Australia's gone a slightly kind of hybrid approach where we have these privacy principles. I think it's Privacy Principle 8 effectively says that it's the entity collecting the data is responsible wherever that data is held. But if you want to essentially transfer personal data to a third country, you've got to have a certain level of confidence that, you know, there's going to be a level of privacy protection which is not essentially equivalent, but somewhat equivalent to the way it would be protected in Australia. So it sort of puts a responsibility on the entity collecting the data to sort of make sure that they've got arrangements in place with wherever they send it to, that it is consistent with the Australian privacy principles. The US is a complex hybrid arrangement where they have some sectoral specific privacy laws, such as around children or around health data, which are very robust. And then for the rest of the personal data world, they effectively rely on the companies to publish their privacy policies and to comply with them. And then it is essentially the company's liability if there's a data breach, whether it's in the US or globally. So, you know, it's very much kind of like a bottom-up accountability-based approach in the US, rather than the sort of the GDPR approach, which actually the European Commission actually inspects third countries' privacy sort of regimes before granting them adequacy. And so they've all got different impacts on digital trade. So the European approach is, you know, probably more restrictive because adequacy has been typically very hard to get. There's maybe 12, 14 countries globally that have been given an adequacy finding. Australia hasn't, just to give one example. And so that means that if you don't have an adequacy finding, you're relying on binding contractual rules or standard contractual clauses. They've got inflexibilities built into them. They're also somewhat costly, so there are small business challenges there. And so, you know, the evidence is in that, you know, it's not that GDPR is not, you know, an effective regime for protecting privacy, but it's struck the balance between privacy and the kind of the digital trade opportunities in one particular place. The US has struck it in a different place. Essentially, the US has got a very different, you know, the whole conception around privacy in the US essentially developed much more as a view of keeping government out of one's personal data. And also it was a tort originally that was more concerned with sort of interference by media and others into one's personal life. And there's also a very strong commitment to free speech in Article 1 of the Constitution, and a lot of kind of like data and access to data is seen as elements of free speech. And so the US also has a different approach where they strike a different balance between kind of the economic opportunities from digital trade and privacy and so on and so forth. And so the question really is for governments, and this is kind of true for privacy, but it's true for just thinking about regulation, because you want to regulate to achieve cyber security, you want to regulate for consumer protection, you want to regulate because data is very much now a national security issue. And so there's, you know, an element there. It's how do you essentially achieve your legitimate regulatory goals while trying to minimize the kind of negative impacts on the economic digital trade opportunity side. So that's sort of the framing and I think the challenge for regulators.
Yeah, and it seems trying to keep up with the technology for domestic regulation, and then layering on top of that how international negotiations and agreements are trying to help countries meet their domestic regulatory and public policy objectives. It's sort of never ending. You know, there's this whole new lot of technology coming out, which seems to be happening every year. And then for regulators to keep up with that, to keep the public happy and confident that their data is being protected and that there's due oversight and regulation of those digital processes. And then internationally, because it's sort of critical for countries to have in place arrangements that's trying to find that balance, as you say, between appropriate protection as well as enabling commercial flows and data flows as part of those commercial flows. As you know, there have been some recent developments. I think the US used to be at the forefront of trying to just capitalize on the commercial opportunities. That's sort of been their focus. With the Biden administration, there's been a shift towards identifying what they call worker-led trade policy and looking at environmental issues and prioritizing those over commercial opportunities and market efficiencies in trade negotiations. So on the digital negotiations, we know the US have done a bit of a U-turn in the last couple of weeks, and Devin Witten's put a question in there. Don't know if you can see it, Josh, but the question is, do you have any views on Simon Lester's comments that the US retreat on data rules isn't that much of a concern? He quotes Simon's view that crafting rules for digital trade is a big deal, and it's worth spending some time thinking about the core principles of trade law and how we want them to apply here.
Yeah, I mean, so just a bit of, I guess, background before we get into what this might mean. USTR, I think on the 24th of October, came out with a sort of a very short statement, effectively saying that when it comes to the e-commerce negotiations in WTO, that they were taking a step back from some of the negotiations around data. And so, just for the sake of rounding this out, in modern trade agreements, there is a digital chapter typically, and the real innovative parts in that chapter are commitments to cross-border data flows, commitments to no data localization requirements, and a commitment in a sense to not requiring access to source code as a condition of trade. And they're all subject to a general exceptions provision based on GATS Article 14. I'm not sure if that's a little technical, but essentially it provides the policy space for governments to, ignore those trade commitments, to discriminate, to restrict data flows, to achieve other public policy goals like privacy, consumer protection, but they have to be essentially necessary, which is typically understood as being like least trade restrictive. So you want to identify the policy measure that effectively achieves your goal, but is also least restrictive on data flows or data localization, whatever the commitment may be. And these are the commitments that the USTR at least has signaled that they want to revisit. And then more recently, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework discussions, which were meant to wrap up last week in APEC, on the trade pillar, sort of didn't really do that. And part of that is they also took a step back in terms of pushing for digital trade rules in IPEF as well. And there's two elements. This is kind of a bit inside the beltway, but I think worth just spelling out here to kind of get a sense of where the US is actually at. I think what's increasingly clear is that that this didn't go through a particularly robust interagency process. Certainly, Department of Commerce has sort of come out kind of questioning why this is happening. I think the National Security Council has expressed concern, but the Department of Justice, which is responsible for some of the antitrust litigation, I think has been supportive of this. And this is the other piece, which is, there's a coalition of Democrats who are, particularly focused on some, have particular concerns about like big tech, and the concerns are typically like competition. So, you've seen in the Federal Trade Commission some pretty robust attempts to, start what they call antitrust in the US, but sort of, competitive, complaints about anti-competitive practices against Google and Amazon and elsewhere. So there's a real push on the antitrust sort of anti-competitiveness space. There were concerns about, the impact on consumers. There are issues now with what this source code commitment might mean for AI regulation. And so, these sets of domestic concerns have, I think, really were what prompted USTR to sort of take a step back. So I think the view that was developed was that these commitments that we had been making, so the most robust commitments the US has made so far on digital trade are in USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, might constrain the policy space to achieve these other goals, right? Antitrust enforcement and consumer protection and so forth. So that's where they're at. I think that it's a sort of a dynamic space, because there's clearly, I think, going to be further interagency discussion, I think, around, where the US ultimately ends up in this space. And it's also, I think, not been well articulated really why the current setup in the trade agreements in fact constrains some of the policy options that the US might want to take. And so I've been part of various discussions on this over the last couple of weeks, and I've heard a lot about this issue about policy space, but it's not sufficiently targeted the conversation yet in terms of, well, what exactly do these commitments prevent you from potentially wanting to do? So I think this is an ongoing discussion in terms of where it's going to end up.
Okay, and does that have any? Are there any national security aspects to the US's shift at all, or do you think it's principally the privacy issue and wanting to address those competition issues with some of those big companies?
I think primarily the latter rather than the former. In fact, what we will increasingly see is that the argument that this is actually sort of at odds with a broader kind of national strategy that the US is having, and a national security strategy for that matter, in terms of the way it's trying to develop global rules and engage with allies and push back against China, in part because the whole development of the digital economy and digital technologies is central to the competition that the US is in with China, and the view that you've got to be first on some of these cutting edge technologies if you're going to have the leading world leading economy and all the implications that flow from that for national security. There are other value issues which come in, particularly around AI regulation, and so the democracy autocracy framing that is current with the Biden administration, finds purchase at some level in terms of, okay, so we need to make sure that kind of we frame the way AI governance happens, because a lot of this technology is infused with values, and it's either going to be democratic values, authoritarian values, and rules on like the digital economy, data flows, data localization are very much supportive of the kind of broader rollout and development of these technologies globally. So we will see a lot more of, I think, this being articulated as various stakeholders push back, I think, against this USTR position.
It's just one of those other issues at this coalface of increasing industrial policy and trade protectionism that seems to be coming to the fore because of those national security demands, because of the rise of China and how the West, for want of a better word, is trying to deal with it. And I think, it's a very live debate here in Australia on how we manage open markets with national security objectives. And I think a lot of people still, we haven't figured that out. It's how do you continue to prioritize your values in open markets and allowing free market flows with the need to protect some particular strategic sectors And as Jake Sullivan says, you know, the high walls around small yards. But as I like to say, I think the walls are mesh, and it's very hard to contain some sectors. And I think digital is really at the coalface of that, in terms of how we find this balance between what we traditionally value and how we achieve national security objectives. It's a tough one.
Yeah, no, I think this is going to be the debate that's going to shape us for a while. And you're absolutely right. It's unclear where this settles down. Like, what does an equilibrium from a US perspective at least look like with respect to China and trade? How small are those yards and how high are those fences? And you're exactly right. Particularly, I mean, we do a lot of work. I do a lot of work around AI, and it's because it's a general purpose technology, right? And it's a dual use technology. It's not clear, you know, where do you draw the boundary between, oh, this AI is okay and this AI is not, right? You know, and so there's an attempt to kind of do that. But if you look at the export controls that came out in October 2022, and then the Mate 5, the Huawei phone, which sort of had demonstrated a workaround from those export control rules, got re-upped and re-updated, you know, recently again in October 2023. So, you know, there's kind of a bit of a whack-a-mole process going on here as China kind of finds loopholes and workarounds as the technology changes and so forth. And so you're constantly sort of having to adjust and change what that yard looks like in order to get at your national security objectives. And I think that'll be kind of a constant process. You know, like businesses on the one hand are going to constantly ask for certainty and predictability. I think businesses at the end of the day would like a list. Here's what you can and can't kind of export. And I think, yeah, government in the US is certainly very sympathetic to trying to provide that certainty. But I think the reality of the policy environment is that it's still for a while probably going to be one where there's going to be a need for just constant fine tuning and adjustments as the technology changes and we get more familiar with how different governments can use it.
I feel being in Australia, we tend to be at the end of the queue when it comes to trying to have any say or influence on these broader issues. I think on digital, we've always been supportive of open policies. And that said, public privacy is always factored into Australia's positions in trade negotiations as well. It's been an important part of our negotiating position. But I feel, does Australia, or how what's happening in the US on digital, how that impacts on smaller countries, does that factor into the conversation at all? Not really.
Yeah, well, by smaller conversations, you mean like Australia
Yes,
or like
yes.
more countries?
Australia and those that aren't obviously China or Europe, pretty much everyone else.
Yeah, look, you know this well. I mean, how hard it is for other countries and governments to penetrate the policy discussion in Washington. But I do think that you know, the part of the administration's broader rethink about how to deal with China, I think, has been that the US can't do this alone and really needs strong allies that can deeply align on some very complex policy issues. I mean, just to take example, export controls, it makes no sense for the US to do it alone when, you know, a lot of the core lithography that is used to actually make the high-end semiconductors comes from ASML in the Netherlands. Japan's got like a lot of capabilities on, you know, chip manufacturing. So, you know, it would simply mean that China would, you know, other companies would backfill, the US would lose out commercially without a big gain from the security front. So there's been a ton of work with allies, which I think is at a very kind of complex, detailed technology level, which I think has been a little unprecedented. I think countries like Australia, but there are others, you know, have a really important opportunity to provide you know, a way of thinking about how do you balance kind of the commitment to a rules-based kind of open trading system with achieving these national security goals, which is different not only from how the US does it, but like the EU, as you know, is its own thing and will do its own thing. And that takes up a lot of bandwidth at the moment in Washington. But I think, you know, Australia as an ally and a close friend and a trusted partner in so many different ways brings its own perspective. It's in the region. It's got different equities than Europe does when it comes to China, and has got a mature, technology sector, obviously a mature economy, and has, I think, a lot to say about, how that balance might get struck, which the US can learn from. And so I do think that Australia can do a lot of that, and I do see that. I do see that happening. So I do think that's a positive opportunity for Australia.
So I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball, and looking forward, what do you think are going to be some of the key issues? Obviously, we talked about national security, but going forward for digital trade.
So I think that let me just focus on a couple. I think that the development of foundational AI models, and ChatGPT is an example of one of them, which kind of hit everyone's attention earlier this year, has really raised a lot of new questions about the pace of technology development, the importance of data and data flows, the importance of algorithms, and the economic opportunity is potentially so significant that we are only at the beginning of trying to understand how do you regulate it, how do you build international cooperation, what are the implications for international trade, and so forth. So I expect this to be the leading edge of a whole policy debate, not only around international trade piece, but I think across a whole range of areas. When one thinks about maximizing the AI opportunity, it's got huge national security implications, huge strategic implications, and it's going to be it will either drive deeper forms of international cooperation, or it will lead to a different type of fracturing. And I think we may even see a bit of both, as you could easily see deepening international cooperation around essentially US and allies and a Chinese-led sort of technology space. And so, that may hasten that development. I think that's kind of been in play for a while. So I think that's one of them. I think the other sort of related part, which is, AI, but it's a broader digital piece, is just the development agenda. It's clear that there's a lot of potential for AI, but really a lot of the precursor technologies to AI. I mean, clearly, I mentioned before, we've still got about 50% of the world offline. You increasingly need access online to have access to services, to various forms of digital infrastructure. And so the opportunities there is to close that gap, but failure to do that, I think we see further fracturing and further kind of inequality, and essentially differences in outcomes between the world that's kind of digital and the world that's not. And I think this is a huge opportunity, potentially a huge challenge. So I think that is increasingly a development type of issues that the Multilateral Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, the regional development banks, the development departments, DFAT, USAID are looking at a lot more closely. So I think that's kind of important. And then I think there's, the way these technologies get diffused and used. So there's a technology climate agenda, which I think will be increasingly important, just to provide one example, and so forth. So I think that's it. And then the final piece is, what are the rules? Where are we going to develop the norms and the rules? Because we have a WTO system, which, even if was functioning in the sense that there was an appellate body, I think given geopolitical fracturing, it's hard to imagine how you can build the types of cooperation you need to build around technologies, specifically in multilateral forum at the moment. That would include the G20, where China and Russia are obviously party to the WTO, and elsewhere. So it may mean that we're in these G7 plus, possibly some new kind of forum for cooperation on technology that would also bring in trade type issues into that space to consider them as well. But I think we're sort of only beginning to have to rethink what are the kind of forum and mechanisms that we can build globally, where we can actually start talking about new rules and norms that are going to be crucial to sort of guiding these technologies, regulating these technologies, ensuring that as we think about them domestically, the kind of the spillover effects are not too harmful and so forth. And that's a trade issue in so many different ways. I mean, we've had so much experience dealing with the impact of domestic regulation on kind of international trade and kind of economic and outcomes globally, and how do you kind of get optimal outcomes there. And so there's a lot of learning there, which will be, I think, really applicable to the trade space, but you'll just have the layer of technology, which will kind of make it more complicated, but also I think interesting.
My sense is people are so embedded in the digital world. They use digital technology in so many ways in their everyday life, yet there's really limited understanding of both the technology, but also the implications of the technology for people. And I think governments will be driven by what their populations want quite often. So if there's that lack of awareness, whether there's going to be pressure on governments to prioritize the regulation of digital trade, I mean, it's obviously happening, but my sense is it's not being driven by the general population. It's like specialty groups and civil society groups and business groups who are driving the push. But once there's greater understanding in the general population in different countries as to the importance of this technology for their way of life, but also the implications of it, then you'll start to see governments prioritizing it and talking more about digital trade. And then that would then lead on to international negotiations. I mean, international never seems to feature, at least in Australia. International trade negotiations that rarely feature as priority policy issues for government. So yeah, there's such a long way to go in terms of building that understanding, which can then inform debate and inform public policy development. I think Australia is way behind, and I think there's so much more we need to do. So I hope this webinar, we'll have to have you back on, Josh, to get into the weeds a bit more as issues evolve, but also your opportunity that Policyware provides for people to tap into deep expertise in these issues. You know, you don't have to go to Yale, you can still get a Yale taught course. I mean, you don't have to go to Washington and go to a Brookings event. You can get Brookings experts talking to you. So I think that's absolutely brilliant. It's like bringing expertise to the public in a really practical way and easy to access way is absolutely fantastic. There are no more questions. If anyone has any more questions, please put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we might wrap up unless there's anything else you wanted to add, Josh.
No, this has been great. It's been a rich conversation and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So, you know, thank you so much for having me on this platform of yours. And yeah, very much look forward to future engagements. Happy to come back whenever you want me back, Bruce. Just, yeah, you know where I am. You know how to contact.
Brilliant. But thank you too. I know it's late where you are, so I appreciate you making the time after hours, and really look forward to catching up again soon.
Yeah, definitely. Likewise. Great.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you, everyone.